Hi everyone. Today's unit that we'll be doing is commercial trust law, and the learning outcome we'll be doing today is learning outcome 3, which is to understand the differences between the rights and duties and powers of trustees operating commercial trust as opposed to those operating family trust. So before we carry on with learning outcome 3, I want to just give you a summary of what we did in the last learning outcome, which was learning outcome 2. In that learning outcome, we looked at understanding the way trusts are used in commercial transactions and how issues are dealt with according to the norms of contract and trust law. So we looked at commercial uses of trust, we looked at contract law and trust law, we looked at trusts implied by law, so resulting and constructive trusts, we looked at contract law terms and their interpretations. We also looked at trustee contract of appointment, liabilities and breach. We also looked at equitable remedies, the provision in their contract of employment. We looked at excluding liability for a range of defaults, pension trusts and bonds. We looked at commercial uses of trust. So we looked at trusts in commercial transactions, trust for clients, customers, monies, trust as a form of security, and trusts in collective investment schemes, and trust for employee benefits. So we looked at 2.1, which was to analyse the context of commercial transactions into contract with trust law and equity law, and how these principles intersect and influence each other. So we looked at, firstly, contract law in commercial transactions. So we looked at the formation of contracts, typically how a contract is formed, so through offer, acceptance, exchange of consideration, and a legally binding contract. We then went on to look at the importance of terms of a contract, so why terms and duties are obligated on the parties. And we then went on to look at the breach of contract. So if a party fails to fulfill its contractual terms and conditions, how this would constitute a breach of the contract. We then went on to look at the specific performance. We then went on to look at trust law in commercial transaction, so use of trust structures, trust fiduciary duties, and enforcement of trusts. We then went on to look at equity in commercial transactions, so we looked at the supplementation of law, equitable remedies, and the doctrine of estoppel. And we then went on to look at 2.2, which is to evaluate the interactions between contract law and trust law. We looked at the formation of trusts, so how trusts can be created. And we looked at the contractual agreements between the settlor and the trustees. We then went on to look at express trusts and how they are created in terms of trust and implied trusts also. We then went on to look at fiduciary duties, so how trustees owe fiduciary duties to the beneficiaries, enforcement of trust arrangements, and modification of trust terms. We then went on to look at remedies, which is breach of trust, including breaches of contractual obligations. And we went on to look at 2.3, which was to look at explaining how trusts are bound, not bound up with contract. So we looked at equitable doctrine, we looked at trust creation and parties involved, and we looked at the enforceability and nature of obligations. We then went on to look at 2.4, which is looking at analysing how trustees limit their liability. how they limit their liability. We also looked at specific provisions in regard to the scope of trustees' duties. We looked at exclusion of liability clauses, insurance, and appointment of professional trustees. We then went on to look at delegation of duties, acting with authority, and regular review and monitoring of trustees, and seeking court approval. And we looked at that in regards to learning outcome 2. Now we're going to go on to learning outcome 3, is to look at understanding the differences between the rights and duties of trustees operating commercial trusts as opposed to those operating family trusts. So the indicative content we're going to look at powers, duties, and rights. In a family setting. We also looked at powers, duties, and rights of trustees in a commercial setting, comparative trusts, nature of a trust, comparison between commercial and family settings. Key terminology, so we looked at trustees, duties, and powers, fiduciary duties, duty of care, duty to act in the best interests of beneficiaries, duty to comply with the terms of the trust, and power to manage and invest trust assets, power to appoint and remove beneficiaries, and power to amend the trust deed. We then went on to look at the key terminology, which is looking at the differences between commercial and between family trusts. And we're looking at the nature and purpose of the trust. And the complexity of trust arrangements, the sophistication of beneficiaries, the degree of trustee discretion, emphasis on commercial objectives versus personal family objectives, or the potential for conflicts of interest. Key terminology, so the comparative trust concept, so bare trusts, interest in possession trust, discretionary trust, accumulation and maintenance trusts, and then trust administration, so the trust accounting and reporting, tax compliance, regulatory requirements, professional trustee services. 3.1, evaluate the powers of a trustee operating commercial trust and one operating a family trust. Investment powers, so trustees of commercial trusts often have broad investment powers to manage trust assets effectively. These powers may include the authority to buy, sell and trade securities, real estate and other investment instruments. Commercial trustees are expected to exercise these powers prudently and in accordance with the trust's investment objectives and risk tolerance. So business management. So in commercial trusts involving business interests or corporate assets, trustees may have the power to manage and operate the business on behalf of the trust. This includes making strategic decisions, entering into contracts, and engaging in commercial transactions to further the trust's business interests. Trustees must act in the best interests of the trust and its beneficiaries when exercising these powers. Then we looked at contractual powers. So trustees of commercial trusts may have the authority to enter into contracts and agreements on behalf of the trust. This includes negotiating terms, executing contracts, and enforcing contractual rights and obligations. Trustees must ensure that any contracts entered into are with the scope of their authority and are in the best interests of the trust. Discretionary distributions. So commercial trustees may have discretion to distribute income or assets to beneficiaries based on the terms of the trust. This discretion allows trustees to adapt to changing business conditions, investment opportunities, or beneficiary needs. However, trustees must exercise their discretion in a fair and impartial manner, considering the interests of all beneficiaries and the purpose of the trusts. Risk management. So trustees of commercial trusts have a duty to manage risk effectively to protect trust assets and minimize liabilities. This may involve implementing risk management strategies, obtaining insurance coverage, and seeking professional advice on legal, financial, and regulatory matters. Trustees must balance the potential risk and rewards of various investment and business decisions to safeguard the trust's interests. So powers of a trustee operating a family trust. So before we go into the family trust, just to identify that commercial trusts are used literally for transactions where third-party commercial trading manages the assets on behalf of the benefactor, which the benefactor or another entity may have set up. Examples of commercial trusts may include infrastructure against public assets, and they may produce an income for them. Also, when we look at commercial trusts, it's important to identify the difference between commercial trusts with relevance to family trusts, which we'll be looking at next. Commercial trusts, as we said, exist in a variety of forms. While the principles applied that to each variety are not identical, they may be similar. For example, many uses have arisen from the same essence of a trust, independence of trust property. This makes a trust an ideal tool with which to produce the segregation effect required by modern banking and financial operations. Looking at the other assets held by the manager. So, trusts nowadays are, used in regards to trying to identify the commercial sides of it. So the nature of a trust is to govern, is where the assets and underlying assets are situated. So it's really important to differentiate between a commercial trust and a family trust. The next one we're looking at is powers of a trustee operating a family trust. So asset management. So trustees of family trusts are responsible for managing trust assets for the benefit of family members and other beneficiaries. These include investing trust funds, maintaining real estate properties, and managing financial assets such as stocks and bonds. Trustees must act prudently and in accordance with the trust investment objectives and the needs of the beneficiaries. Estate planning. So family trustees may have powers related to estate planning, such as the authority to make distributions to beneficiaries, establish trusts for minor or incapacitated beneficiaries, or implement tax planning strategies. Trustees must consider the long-term financial needs and the welfare of family members when exercising these powers, taking into account factors such as education, healthcare, and quality of life. Dispute resolution. So trustees of family trusts may have the power to resolve disputes among family members or beneficiaries regarding trust management matters. This may include mediating conflicts, interpreting trust provisions, or seeking court intervention if necessary. Trustee must remain impartial and act in the best interests of all beneficiaries when addressing disputes and conflicts. Family support. So family trustees may have discretion to provide financial support or assistance to family members in times of need. This may include making distributions for living expenses, education costs, healthcare expenses, or other financial needs. Trustees must exercise their discretion responsively, considering the welfare and best interests of the beneficiaries. Education and advancement. Trustees of family trusts must have powers related to education and advancements for the beneficiaries. This may include funding educational expenses, providing opportunities for skill development or vocational training, or supporting entrepreneurial endeavours. Trustees must balance the needs of current and future beneficiaries and promote their personal and professional growth. A family trust, as we mentioned, is any trust you set up that benefits members of your family. So it's often used as a legally binding agreement to establish who will receive portions of your wealth after you pass away. The type of living trust can be either revocable, meaning that you can alter the terms or cancel it entirely, or irrevocable, which means that you cannot modify the trust at all without the approval of everyone within it, depending on the type. There are typically three parties involved in a family trust: a guarantor, trustee, and the beneficiaries. The guarantor is the person who establishes the trust, whose assets will be dispersed according to what's laid down in it. The beneficiaries are the family members who will receive the financial assets from the trust, and a trustee is the person responsible for managing the assets in the trust on behalf of what the beneficiary has intended to put in the trust. So there are many different types of trusts, which we've gone in previously in the last session as well: living trust, matrimonial trust, charitable trusts. When we look at why a family trust is needed, if you have assets that you want to pass on to your loved ones after you've gone, then a family trust will be legally make sure that they're left on the terms that you want them. So a living family trust ensures that your family will hopefully be able to avoid the sometimes painful, long and expensive process of probate. Probate is the legal process of distributing any sort of assets in an estate, and usually occurs where the person dies and doesn't have a will, or their estate is larger than the state government's limit. Taking care of that process, through a family trust avoids any sort of financial or emotional costs of probate process. So, it's an easier way of doing it with less kind of issues for your family, because, it's really important that, families try not going through the probate process, because it's quite a lengthy process, but also a process that it's kind of it's there to benefit your family members with the purpose of being progressively to transfer your trusts over your lifetime, so that they don't have to go through any sort of inheritance tax purposes. And it's like it creates a safeguard for your assets and ensures that they ultimately pass to those beneficiaries that you choose, no matter what happens. So your trust would be given to the beneficiaries that you choose, rather than what within a probate, what is given to the family members. So you have actually put that in place so that they're able to get that once you pass away as well. So it's really important. And it's really important that it's done properly, that you need to draft the document properly. You need to make sure that if there's any sort of special terms and conditions you want to apply in it, you must put that in it. A family trust lets you decide who gets what and when, and you can also ensure that family members with functional needs don't tend to lose out, access to any sort of government benefits because of the inheritance. You need to, certain types of family trust can reduce tax assets as well, and you need to make sure that you are doing what you think is fair. So in conclusion, in summary, while trustees of both commercial and family trusts have fiduciary duties to manage trust assets prudently and in the best interests of the beneficiaries, the specific powers and responsibilities may vary depending on the nature and the purpose of the trust. As we mentioned, the differences between them. Commercial trust focuses on business management, investment, and risk management, while family trustees prioritize asset management, estate planning, family support, and dispute resolution. So understanding these differences is essential for trustees to fulfill their duties effectively in their respective trust content. So, they need to identify their duties within a family trust, which will be different to their duties within a commercial trust, because the family trust is more in regards to, try to provide stuff for their own children maybe, or husband, or the main purpose is to pass their assets on from one family member to another. It ensures that they benefits the children, grandchildren, siblings, or any other members, and they are common in estates, and certain beneficiaries receive this on when the guarantor dies. So 3.2, compare and contrast rights and duties imposed upon a trustee of a commercial or trust or family trust. So commercial trust, these are responsibilities. So, when you have duties, when someone sets up a trust, they appoint people as trustees, as we mentioned, to manage the trust. The trust deed will usually be specific instructions on how to do this, but there are generally legal duties that they have to follow. Trustees must comply with various trustees' acts. It's a legal duty. The trustee owes, excuse me, owes duties of honesty, integrity, loyalty, and good faith in the beneficiaries of the trust. They must act exclusively in the best interest of the trust and be actively involved. So the rights we're going to look at now. So investment powers. Trustees of commercial trust often have broad investment powers to manage trust assets prudently and maximize returns. They may have the authority to invest in a wide range of assets, including stocks, bonds, real estate, and alternative investments, subject to the terms of the trust deed and applicable laws. Management authorities. So commercial trustees typically have extensive management authority over trusts, including the power to buy, sell, lease, or otherwise deal with the trust's property in the ordinary course of business. They may also have the authority to enter into contracts, negotiate transactions, and make investment decisions on behalf of the trust. Contractual powers. So trustees of commercial trusts may have the power to enter into contracts and agreements on behalf of trusts, such as leases, financing arrangements, or business contracts. This may also have the authority to negotiate terms, execute documents, and enforce contractual rights and obligations. The duties. So they have fiduciary duties. So trustees of commercial trusts or fiduciary duties to beneficiaries, including duties of loyalty, care, and impartiality. They must act in the best interest of the beneficiaries and exercise their powers prudently and in good faith. Breaches of fiduciary duties may result in personal liability for trustees. Prudent management. So trustees have a duty to manage trusts' assets prudently and in accordance with the standard of care expected of a prudent investor. They must exercise reasonable care, skill, and diligence in managing trust investments and avoid speculative or high-risk investments that may jeopardize any trust assets. Compliance obligations. So trustees of commercial trusts are responsible for ensuring compliance with legal and regulatory requirements governing trust administration, including tax laws, financial reporting standards, and industrial regulations. They need to engage in professional advisors to seek legal guidance to fulfill their compliance effectively and obligations are met effectively. And this is in regards to, the fact that, they need to follow the laws of the jurisdiction and apply to that. Family trustees and their duties. So rights are distribution discretion. So trustees of family trusts often have discretionary powers to distribute trust income or assets to beneficiaries based on the terms of the trust deed and the trustee's discretion. They may have the authority to determine the timing, amount, and beneficiaries of trust distributions, taking into account the beneficiaries' needs and circumstances. Asset management. So family trustees may have authority over trust assets, including the power to invest, manage, and administer trust property for the benefit of the beneficiaries. They may have the discretion to retain or dispose of assets, reinvest income, or allocate resources to meet the beneficiaries' needs. Decision-making authority. Trustees of family trusts may have decision-making authority over significant trust matters, such as investment strategies, distribution policies, or succession planning. They may have the power to make decisions independently or in consultation with beneficiaries or advisors, depending on the terms of the trust. So duties. Fiduciary duties similar to commercial trusts. Trustees of family trusts or fiduciary duties to the beneficiaries, including duties of loyalty, care, and impartiality. They must act in the best interest of the beneficiaries and avoid any sort of conflict of interest or self-dealing that could undermine trust integrity. The beneficiary consideration. So trustees have a duty to consider the needs of interests of the beneficiaries when exercising their duties and making decisions regarding trust administration. They must act impartially and without favoritism, ensuring fair treatment and equitable distribution of the trust benefits among beneficiaries. Confidentiality and privacy. So trustees of family trusts have duty to maintain confidentiality and privacy regarding trust affairs, including trust assets, distributions, and beneficiary information. They must respect the privacy rights of beneficiaries and refrain from disclosing sensitive trust-related information without proper authorization. As we stated, there are responsibilities, and this is looking at the general duties of trustees, both commercial and trustees. They must comply with the Trustee Acts, and some of the general duties are to observe, as we mentioned earlier, some of these duties, just to reiterate, to observe the terms of the contract. So trustees must learn the terms of the trust and comply strictly with the duties and directions set out in the trust deed. They must act impartially between beneficiaries. So trustees usually have a duty to ensure that one beneficiary shouldn't suffer at the expense of another. It's common for trustee to require the trustees balance potentially competing interests for income and capital to provide information. So trustees must have clear and accurate accounts for the trust. It can be helpful if trustees have beneficiaries with relevant information and documents relating to the trust to act unanimously. So trustees must act unanimously unless the deed says otherwise, and to act carefully and distribute the assets correctly. For example, in a life interest trust, the trustees must distribute any income to the life tenant beneficiaries, but still preserve the value of the capital. The rights of beneficiaries varies dependent on the specific wording of the trustees. So, and if a trustee does not comply, as we mentioned earlier, with their duties and responsibilities, the trust beneficiaries can apply to the court to have them removed. The court can also direct the trustees on how correctly to administer the trust. So the trustees can appoint a replacement to succeed any trustees to agree to step down to retire. So, there are different ways in how a trustee should be dealing with things, and how someone chooses a trustee. Sometimes in the family one, it could be family or friends, a lawyer or, an attorney. And when we've looked at, them, they have to comply with their fiduciary duties as well. Trustees' duties, just to reiterate, is that they may also change over time. In most cases, you can create a trust. You are both the trustee and the beneficiary, and you have more flexibility over what you can and cannot do. This makes sense because you're responsible for your own self. If you ever become incapacitated or upon your death, the person you name as a successor trustee then steps in. So, it's really important when we look at trustees, their rights and responsibilities. They have fiduciary rights that they must follow, and legal rights. In conclusion, so in summary, while trustees of commercial trusts and family trusts have similar fiduciary duties to act in the best interests of beneficiaries, their rights and duties may differ based on the nature and objectives of the trust. Commercial trusts have often broader powers and contractual authority than family trusts. While family trusts have more focus on the distribution, discretion, asset management and beneficiary consideration. So, it's important both types of trustees may adhere to legal and ethical, frameworks. They need to make sure they are following the law. They are, they have responsibilities they must follow. You could be an individual or an executor, but you must choose your trustee, and their role is to administer, communicating with the beneficiaries. The bottom line is that the trustee is someone who has been granted fiduciary responsibility to care for the assets placed in a trust. And there are many reasons for placing assets in a trust, from ensuring your income to growing wealth, or for your family and your friends having it distributed. So it's really important that all trusts are complied with and followed with their duties. So we've finished learning outcome 3 now. These are some of the references we've used for learning outcome 3, which is things like Macpherson, the powers of duties of trustees; Langburn, the contradiction basis of the law of trust; Maudsley is the trust and trustees; Barlett, the law of international trust; Chambers, the principles of international trust; Douglas, understanding trusts and estates; Maitland, looking at equity, also the forms of common law; Miller, remedies in commercial transactions; Mitchell, trust law; Pierce, the law of trust and equitable; Richardson, equity and trusts; and Underhill, law relating to trust and trustees; and Vertigo, the principles of equity and trust. So we've finished learning outcome 3 now. The next learning outcome is learning outcome 4, and then the assignment session. So please go on to Moodle for any sort of ebooks, recordings for the lectures, and any sort of journals or additional reading is on Moodle for you to go on to. If there's any issues or any questions that you have around this unit, please send any queries or questions to learnerwork@ukvarsity.co.uk, and any submission of the assignment would be done after the final assignment session, which would be after learning outcome 4, and that would be submission would be 2 weeks after that, and you would have to submit the assignment to learnerwork@ukvarsity.co.uk. And thank you. Any sort of resources, anything, please go on to Moodle. And thank you for attending today's session, and I will see you in the next session, which is learning outcome 4. Thank you. Thanks.